Well, hi everybody. Hi. Welcome to the Chakra Way Meditation Podcast. I'm Rosanne and I have another lovely guest for you today. So, Tara Cousineau is a clinical psychologist or therapist, an author, a counselor at Harvard, and I'm really interested in the work that Tara does because Tara's main, or one of her main kind of strands, is looking at the issues around perfectionism. And when I came across Tara, I kind of laughed to myself because that's one thing that I cannot say that I suffer with. I am probably at the opposite end of perfectionism. I like to embrace the wabi-sabi, the chaos of life. But I know that there are people close to me who have that perfectionist tendency, very high standards, should we say. And so I thought, yeah, this could be really interesting. So thank you, Tara, for coming on and
It's
meeting
a
with me.
it's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah. So you've obviously been a clinical psychologist for a while. That training that you do doesn't take 5 minutes, it takes many years. And so what brought you to land with this kind of focus into perfectionism?
That's an excellent question. I would say that there's sort of many seasons to a career.
Mm,
However, when I look back, when you can finally say you can look back at the arc of your life,
yeah.
is I perfectionism was always part of my upbringing and my conditioning. My mother, who is in her 80s now, is German. She's very organized and efficient. It's just part of the DNA. We grew up with having to have things nice and neat and couldn't really leave the house until we were sort of neat and proper. It was just part of the atmosphere, and it just sort of absorbed those kinds of tendencies. But it really wasn't until I think I approached those middle school years where the importance of fitting in and belonging becomes so paramount that you start to compare, despair, all of these sorts of things. I say now, like, thank God I didn't have a smartphone when I was a kid, because I think it would have just amplified a lot of the unrealistic ideals. And then later I became a psychologist because I was a people pleaser and a helper. And it was just, an empath. And I felt I was good at it and pursued that. And and then I would say over the last maybe 10 years, I uh, I started I actually was trained at Harvard Medical School for my internship and postdoc years, and then I went off and did all these different things. And then I came back to Harvard to work in the counseling center as sort of like a career change.
Mm,
And it was kind of crazy because I was like, what was I thinking? But all of a sudden, day in and day out, I am meeting from people all over the world. When people think Harvard, they think the college students, but actually, Harvard is much more than that. I mean, there's people who come literally from all over the world, all walks of life. And
yes,
all
yes.
of the sudden, they're in this incubator, if you will, this bubble of achievement where you might have been sort of, the big fish in a small pond where you grew up academically, and then you come to a place where everyone's actually really doing great things.
Mm,
And and I thought, well, what is going on here? Like, you almost have to be a perfectionist to get this far in life, this constant striving. And then you get there and you can't actually appreciate your work or your accomplishments, and then you begin to minimize them. And so I just thought that there was this real need to address perfectionism, but not from the typical, oh, you just need to change your mindset. Because
mm,
if people could change their minds, they would, but to come from it really from a different approach. And so I was trained in mindfulness and mindful self-compassion. I started doing a lot of work in internal family systems, which is an approach in psychotherapy. And so I started to bring that to the table. But the really interesting part for me was during the COVID pandemic is that
mm,
all of my techniques didn't work. Like, people weren't really getting better. They were still really suffering from this syndrome of never enough. And then I started to delve into energy medicine and energy psychology, and that really filled a gap and a need that I had never been really trained in. I mean, I had been always going to complementary and alternative medicine practitioners because that's what I love to do, but
Mm.
to actually bring it into my work. And that's sort of how this current book, The Perfectionist Dilemma, was born. And I feel like I'm sneaking energy medicine in the back door.
Good, excellent. We love that.
Yes.
Perfect. Because not everybody is open to that. And I
Mm-mm.
suppose that there's a little bit of I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, but my kind of idea of a perfectionist is that unless it can be kind of proven scientifically, unless they can see it, they don't believe it. And so energy work, which is probably the one thing that they really need, is something they won't go for because it's got not got any sort of end results. There's no kind of like beginning, middle, and end. It's just like a sort of amorphous question mark that could, which for some people, wonderful. That work is ongoing forever and ever. But for a perfectionist who needs results
Mhm.
and needs evidence-based,
Mhm.
then, but it is lovely that there's a lot more evidence-based stuff coming out and science studies being done around energy healing and around.
Absolutely. Right. So I feel like I can confidently say the evidence is coming in at this point. And that's a beautiful thing, whether it's gentle touch techniques, Reiki, complementary alternative medicines, emotional freedom technique. I mean, we're starting to see the science around it. But you're right. People who identify as perfectionists, they're looking for a quick fix, an easy result. They have a sort of a difficult time managing emotions. In fact, they just push them away. They push them
Mm,
down.
mm,
And not every perfectionist is the same. I think one of the things that I've come to understand, and there are lots of research definitions on perfectionism. There's certain sort of stripes and colors, if you will. It's very multifaceted. But a perfectionist could look like a people pleaser, could be a procrastinator, someone who's really trying to do their best, but then their nervous system stops them. And so they go into procrastination and then they go into this sort of, blame and shame mode. There's different nuances,
mm,
but but a core need is, I always say, perfectionism is protection. You learn it as a way to survive in your particular world. And when you can see it as protection versus something that you absolutely must do, or something that is sort of one of those, favorite flaws that you can flaunt, that really comes down to this need for love and belonging, like
mm,
hands down. But you can't really start that way with a perfectionist. You have to kind of build some trust first that you are capable
mhm.
of what you're doing. And then I say the best evidence is your own evidence, is your lived experience. So I invite people to try some things, some energy medicine tools. And I have to say, at this point, people are like, why aren't there more people talking about this stuff? And I'm like, well, there are. You just haven't been, you just
Yeah,
haven't been aware of them.
just not
They're
tuned in.
everywhere.
Yeah, exactly. Just not tuned
You
in.
know?
So
Yeah.
what sort of tools, techniques, uh, things are you teaching people that for which they're having that kind of reaction? I'd be fascinated to know.
Yes. Well, I always say there's the physical and there's the metaphysical, right? And so in more Western approaches, we'd be looking at the physical. So looking at the nervous system, how the nervous system works, how the nervous system works in the brain, that sort of thing. On the metaphysical, with the subtle energies, it really is, I think it can only be sort of experiential. So I try to come at it at both angles. Like, here's how the nervous system works. And
Mm,
also, there's another system in the body. It's your subtle energy and their pathways. And this has been known for centuries and centuries and centuries. And we can work with that too. Are you interested? Now, when I see clients, they're usually coming because they're in some sort of state of anguish or depression or panic. And so the first thing that I do with many people is, as I'm asking sort of my typical intake, tell me about your life, what's going on, I actually have them sit um, in a posture, and this comes from Donna Eden energy medicine, where you're holding um, sort of the There's the triple warmer point, which is right above the elbow. There's a little dimple there. And I'm like, can you put your two fingers right at your elbow here and your other hand at your bottom ribs and give yourself a little hug? Can you do that for me? And then they sit and they cross their arms and they're holding these two acupressure points. And I say, okay, just start breathing a little slower. And they do that for a little bit and they start slowing down. They're like, oh, I feel a little bit better. I'm like, good, stay there for a little bit. Let me ask you some questions. I start
Mm.
asking them their intake questions. And I'm like, okay, switch arms now. So they switch their arms.
Mm.
And within 10 minutes, they're in a calm headspace. And then they can tell me their story in a slower way. And they usually leave the office feeling better. Now, that's just one tool. It's like the secret self hug. And
Mm.
it's a wonderful little skill. Now, has it been subjected to a randomized control scientific study? No. But there are studies that show a few minutes of self compassionate, gentle touch has positive well being benefits. So we can extrapolate and say, well, this is just another gesture. You might do a self compassion gesture with hands over the heart. That is hard to do for perfectionists. That is like not where I would start. But
Mm.
doing something like this, I say, you can sit in class or a board meeting just doing this posture and no one knows.
Yeah.
And you're calming your nervous system and your subtle energies are starting to flow in the right direction.
Mm.
How cool is
Yeah.
that?
I love that. I mean, it's very much the sort of the same approach that I come at this kind of work when clients come to me is, we do it physically and subtly as well, because you have to connect with both parts of yourself. The
Mm,
physical body will support and help the spiritual subtle body, the energy body, and the subtle body and the energy body will help and will show up in the physical. So you can't separate the two. And I think
right.
that what I find really interesting is that this separation that the West has done between the body and the mind, or the body and the spirit, or maybe just all three, they've all been put in separate boxes, going, no, you go with the doctors, you go with the church, you go with
Hmm.
with the psychiatrist, and never the twain shall meet. And I think, crazy as it seems, it feels like those three parts of us are only just beginning to be brought together. But the people who have to be at the front of this charge for this new kind of way of thinking is the people with letters after their names, like because otherwise the people who've not heard about all this or don't understand, they won't believe if I, as a just like, I'm a yoga teacher, I teach the chakras. They're like, yeah, and so what's the proof? What are you talking about? But you come with your PhD and your absolute on a piece of paper certificate that says, no, I'm qualified to do this stuff. And then people believe it, which is why it makes me really happy to talk to somebody like you who's kind of got straddling this with a foot in both camps, able to really bring it to the fore and to help people understand that it is so important that we talk to the body in its subtle energies and in its pranic form, just as much
Mhm.
as trying to talk to the brain. I tell my clients and my students a lot. I say, stop trying to solve this by thinking.
Mhm.
Just do a yoga pose, do a whatever, the suitable pose would be. Just take a child's pose. Just
Exactly.
take that forehead to the floor. Just let it go. Stop trying to think about it and work it out with your clever, clever brain, because the clever, clever brain thinks that it's really clever, but actually, the body is where the real wisdom lives, in the subtle body.
I absolutely agree. Now, I think sometimes it's a blessing and a curse to actually have an advanced degree,
Mm.
because you get sort of pigeonholed. I think there is an opportunity for um, people with their masters and their PhDs to really sort of shout it from the rooftops that
Mm.
these methods work, and they're not new. I think that's the other thing is that we just have to honor the traditions from all over the world that have actually experienced this and documented it, and we somehow just say, oh, that's woo, and we push it out to the side. But I think that people are getting it outside of sort of the placard office wall, there's
Mm,
almost a demand for more of these approaches. And I think that that's very promising. And so, yes, it's kind of like, okay, a top down, bottom up approach. And hopefully, like you said, these areas will somehow meet. I mean, mind body medicine has been around for a long time, but energy hasn't really been a part of it. It's been mindfulness primarily,
mhm.
and sort of the alphabet soup of different psychology methodology, CBT,
Yeah,
ACD, DBT. I mean, there's like the alphabet soup of them,
yeah, that's so true.
which which drives me crazy a little bit. But what you're saying about getting people out of their heads is such a practice. People will often say, well, I think this, or well, I think that. And the minute people just start using the words think or should or what ifs, I'm like, oh, they're just all in their heads. And
Mm,
I need to get them down, just to being down to earth. And so I think that your like approaches and chakra energy work are profound. It's not the first path that I would go into, but that's where acupressure points help me because it
mm.
somehow makes sense. But it opens the gateway for people to go and take a yoga class because I
Yeah,
actually think it's the perfect physical movement for all humans.
agreed. Agreed.
And I just say, I want you to try yoga, and there's many different kinds, and often it comes down to finding the right teacher for
Yeah,
you.
yeah.
Right? Experiment, go out there. But something like yoga is such a beautiful practice because it requires you to breathe
Mm,
slowly. You're focused. It really requires some good attention. It really is actually good training for the brain.
mhm.
And then it engages the parasympathetic nervous system, which most people aren't in.
Mm, yeah, exactly. I mean, I
Yeah.
think many people who go to yoga classes, they go to a yoga class because they know it makes them feel good, and they don't know why.
Right.
And they come out going, well, I know yoga makes me feel better, but they don't know, they don't understand, and they don't have to understand that they've actually just sort of switched on their parasympathetic nervous system,
Mm-hmm.
rather, that they've actually affected themselves physiologically. But it is, yeah, I fully and wholeheartedly agree with you. Yoga is the perfect form of exercise because it creates this balance, this focus, this connection and this conversation with this body that we live in. I just think it's so important that we bring the mind into the body, and I'm guessing, to bring it back to perfectionism. Um, I feel like, there's quite a lot of people. So I start yoga classes and I go, right, I'm launching a yoga class and it's a welcome for beginners. And people will come to me and they'll go, oh, well, I can't join. I'd love to join, but I'm just not flexible enough, or
Mm-hmm.
I would never be able to do it. And I'm like, what? No, this is completely the wrong way of thinking about it. There's an almost a perfectionist view there. It's like if I can't do it, I shouldn't do it. I'm like, well, how on earth do you think people who are, sports people get to be as good as they are? Because they practice. They don't start
Mm-hmm.
off being as good as, in any walk of life. You
Right.
don't ever start off being perfect. You have to fail. You have to fall over. You have to understand where your weaknesses are, where your strengths are. And from that failing, you then learn how to grow, how to maybe overcome those weaknesses and how to make the most of your strengths. And maybe sometime, maybe you're never going to be able to do a handstand. Who cares?
Mm-hmm.
Who cares?
Right.
As long as you kind of are doing the work that feels good. And anyway, I'm diverging
Well, I
away.
agree with you. People feel like they
Hmm.
have to do things perfectly. Same thing. I teach mindfulness classes. And people are like, oh, my mind is too busy. I can't do this. This is not for me.
Same with meditation, yeah.
Right, it's the same challenge
Mm,
that people have. And this is actually where I think pairing a little bit of the brain science, or at least the metaphor, like you were saying, it's about practice. And I say, listen, no one's going to be perfect at this ever because it's a practice, and that's why I use the word practice. And it is really about consistency, and the more you do this, the more you are actually inserting new data into your brain that it doesn't have right now.
mm,
And if you think of your brain like a Netflix recommendation engine, is that if you keep selecting comedies, the only thing that you're going to get are comedies. What if
Yeah.
you want to see a drama or some action hero film? You actually have to insert that data. You have to look for it in order for that recommendation engine to start serving up new information. Your brain's actually the same way. So, if it's yoga or if it's mindfulness, you are inserting new information into your mind body system, and it's going to get used to it over time. Trust it, stick with it. I guarantee you, in 3 weeks, 1 month, you're going to feel really differently about this because you've just accessed the powerful effect of the neuroplasticity in your brain to change. Like that is really incredible. And it's almost like you have to do this little bit of a sales job to say, yeah, it doesn't feel good at first because actually it's so unfamiliar to your body, it's going to resist it. So
Mm.
you have to just keep going at it in a very gentle way, just like if you want to go lose, weight and go to the gym, you're not going to start lifting 50-pound weights. You're going to start with the 5 pounds,
Yeah.
right? We just have to be like compassionate towards ourselves and consistent and just trust that you follow this little plan with this wonderful teacher like you, that things are going to start to shift.
Mm. So do perfectionists see themselves as perfectionists?
Some of them do and some of them don't. So I
Because
lead, yeah,
yeah,
go ahead.
I would imagine that there are some people who, for me, the definition of a perfectionist, and you've already debunked this somewhat, is, somebody whose house is immaculate, is perfect, everything's got its place, and, and they have to, hair has to be immaculate all the time, clothes,
Yeah.
it's a sort of outward thing to me. It's like everything that surrounds you needs to be perfect. Now, you've already debunked that by saying, procrastination is a one form of it, and there are various other forms of it.
Yeah.
But yeah, am I doing a disservice to perfectionism? Because like if you are, just like, no, I just like things how they are and how I want them to be, is that perfectionism or is that standard?
I think that's a aspect of perfectionism, but it's not one that
Mm,
everybody has. You could have a
no.
very sloppy perfectionist.
Oh, really?
Yes, because because they are valuing something else to be sort of perfect. So I know perfectionists who my understanding from their description is that their dorm rooms or their homes are kind of a disaster and they actually need help with that. But they'll be hyper focused on, oh, I don't know, let's say they're a scientist and a researcher and they actually have to have that graph just perfect and they'll spend 20 hours on it. That
Yeah.
and why? Because you're a little moving the dot over a little bit is not going to actually change the reader's experience at all, but they get hyper fixated. So perfectionism is so varied. I mean, there are people who are people pleasers, like I had mentioned,
Mm,
or, and they don't want to make a mistake, or they want to do the right thing, or they want to be seen as good or valuable. So my definition of perfectionism is quite broad. I say that perfectionism is the paradox created by the need for belonging and the fear of rejection, paired with unrealistic expectations for achievement and approval that sap your energy or life force. Like I put
mm,
energy right in there because what happens with people who have perfectionistic tendencies is that they get depleted pretty quickly. They'll end up in burnout, or they might be like, I say, oh, they're constantly doing and undoing, doing and undoing, doing and undoing, and then they're never actually getting farther ahead. They're kind of more spinning in place.
mm.
So I think we need to kind of broaden it. But I have an example recently. I'm running an Overcome Perfectionism group right now. Woman, middle age, had been in a very exacting industry, somewhere in like the finance investment space. And she said, I never thought I was a perfectionist until after I left my job. And it was the kind of job, it's like a sales job. Like if you didn't meet the numbers, you were basically called out at the end of the day. And it was a very shaming experience. And so she learned that she had to be very exact and specific. And she ran herself, to the ground. Basically, she's like, that environment was perfectionistic. And and it made her perfectionistic to the point where she wasn't even taking vacation time. She felt like she had to give up every hour. And I'm like, oh, this is like a really good example of how we are in systems and organizations that have unrealistic expectations and standards.
Don't get me started on that.
Yes.
I've I've never worked in the corporate world, but I have been witness to it lots of people very close to me, and they're like, "Oh yeah, we've got our targets, and are they reachable? No. So what? Everybody's going to be disappointed and feel bad about themselves? Why don't they put the target somewhere realistic so everyone can feel good about themselves? It just blows my mind. Really extraordinary. But yeah, that it's a very it's that system of the world that has been, I guess, developed over the last 100 years,
Mm-hmm.
maybe, where it's just more, bigger production, growth,
Exactly.
growth, 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 expansion, expansion, more money, and at whatever cost. Like, we don't care at what cost. We just need to hit the numbers, and the
Right.
pressure that that puts on people, and and I suppose the rewards in terms of a big juicy salary or bonuses or whatever is the motivator, but it causes people to lose themselves within that. I mean, for me, all of this is solar plexus stuff. It's like
Mm.
running your life on
Mm-hmm.
this inner
Yeah.
fire, and you've got to keep feeding that fire, and it is burning you up from the inside. And everything else that is important, like compassion and empathy for
Mm-hmm.
the self,
Mm-hmm.
just doesn't, there's no room for it. The fire's too hot.
And the corporate world is one place, but we also have the social media environment, which is very similar, right?
Mm.
So young people, are suffering greater than they have in the past with anxiety. It is that sort of what researchers would call the socially prescribed perfectionism, where you're constantly measuring yourself against societal expectations. And that type of perfectionism, you become more vulnerable to mental health issues. So we have to be very mindful. It's very hard to change systems, right? And so, you use the word compassion, and that's why the subtitle in my book, The Perfectionist Dilemma, is Learn the Art of Self-Compassion and Become a Healthy Achiever. Because we actually have to learn how to buffer and offset this onslaught that we get from all directions, in order to preserve, our sense of self-worth, trust in ourselves, and it's a challenge in this
Yeah.
day and age. It really is.
So, so the problem of perfectionism is not my very basic definition. It is much broader, and actually really is an umbrella term over that we can use over a lot of issues that are facing um, the youth of today, and the whole population really. Um, and you've hinted at your solutions as the how to overcome it, um, in terms of compassion. So that for me is moving from the solar plexus overburning into the heart space,
Mhm.
into being more compassionate. And it's interesting, but I just explained to you how I often work with the chakra system and I use the elements. I love using the elements.
Mm.
So we've got the solar plexus there, which is fire. Above, you have the heart chakra, which the element is air. Beneath, you have the element of water, the sacral chakra, which is where our emotions, our
Mhm.
playfulness, our creativity, our sexuality, all of those fun things live, and our emotions, most importantly. And often I say when your fire is too hot, what do? You don't want to blow on it you want to actually damp it down a little bit. So how would you
Mhm.
damp down that overworked burnout? You would go play. You would
Mhm.
have fun. You would, think about sexy time. You would have
Mhm.
you would
Mhm.
you would engage with a playful side of yourself. And invite some more creativity into your life rather than yeah. So I'm just interested to know what your take on that is, and also how you use the heart center. And I'm not saying you can't use compassion, because of course compassion is like the most important thing. How do you go about using the heart chakra too, or the heart space?
Well, so let me answer the first part. I totally agree with you about almost like dropping down, into the water element. With people who struggle with perfectionism and self-identify, I mean, with it, often they're so disconnected from their feelings. Like they've learned to really push that down. And so there's some very basic training around naming your feelings, because perfectionists will come in and say, I'm overwhelmed. And I say, overwhelm is not a feeling. let's drill down. Overwhelm is sort of like an amalgamation, or of many feelings. Let's figure out what that is. And so a lot of it is actually getting down to basics, naming what you're feeling. Is it heartbreak? Is it frustration? Is it irritation? I mean, there's so many nuances to life, and we miss out when we get very big and global, like that fire, that you're describing. So I think that there is something about really kind of getting down to basics,
Mm.
getting rooted, even going further
Yeah.
down. And there is this relational piece that is really about cultivating this kind relationship with yourself. And I'd be interested in where you think this might fit into, the chakra system. And it might be heart, it might be root. I'm not really sure. Um, but one of the things that I facilitate, if you will, is for people to become really familiar with those inner critical narratives. And not in a way of staying in your head, but saying, okay, if you just had a meltdown with your spouse or with your kid because something wasn't going right, what were you saying to yourself? What part of you is that? And often people will say, well, that's my judgy part, or, it's a missed expectation. And I just, I'm blaming them or I'm blaming me. I'm like, oh, right, let's write down exactly what you say to yourself. And when they start to write down, I mean, people can be pretty cruel internally in their own minds, like saying things to themselves that they would never say out loud to somebody else. But when they start to identify that, we can kind of externalize that part and say, oh, how is that part trying to help you? The part that's having the temper tantrum, or the part that's procrastinating, that is a survival function. Let's figure out what it is. And so then I have people name that part. So I'll give you a really concrete example with the whole fire theme. As I was a temper tantrum kid, my parents got divorced. It was a very chaotic household. I had this inherent sense at age 4 and 5 that the world was unfair, which was true because it was for a 5-year-old.
Yeah.
And so I have a part that can get very self-righteous. I can get very sort of indignant. I can get judgy when I think things aren't working in the way that I think that they should. And so I call that part of me Scarlet. I'm like, oh, that's my little Scarlet. And she's really feeling that something is not right. So instead of acting out irrationally, I'm like, oh my God, it's Scarlet. And she's here and she's feeling really bad. What does Scarlet need? Like, what did I need as a kid that I didn't get, that I had to figure out on my own? And so then you start to cultivate compassion for that part of yourself who, in current day, at your current age, is still kind of behaving the way that it did way back when it was trying to figure out how to solve a problem. So
Mm.
cultivating the compassion is having this relationship with that part of you. Now, a lot of people think, oh, well, that's an ego. I'm like, oh, forget the ego. We don't have one ego. We might have 100, because we have
Mm.
all of these different parts that are trying to figure out the world, and they haven't really kind of upgraded,
Yeah.
if you will, over time. So the compassion work towards the inner critic, or the inner critic parts, is really about understanding that it's not your fault. This is here for a reason. Let's look at it clearly and kindly, and help you give yourself what you didn't get back then, that you're still struggling to overcome. So that's the part of my book where I call it, love your inner critic. And it's in the middle of
Mm.
the book because you can never start out with that. But once you get people on board on sort of the physical, treating your body well, going out and playing, doing something fun, having date nights, things like that that you were describing. But it
Mm.
really is, I think, a lot of this sort of compassionate care towards the different parts of yourself that might be really spiking the perfectionistic habits. Like, does that make
Mm.
sense?
Yes, it makes perfect sense. It really does. And for me, all of that work it's all kind of in the heart, but it's all over the
Yeah.
place because, you can have that ego. And I love the fact that you said that we can have 100 different egos, these little parts of us, these little fractured parts of us. And it reminds me
Mm-hmm.
of an inner family work
Mm-hmm.
that I sometimes suggest. I don't facilitate it, but I will introduce people to the idea of it where they have, yeah, we've got the inner child. Everyone knows about that. But I focus quite a lot on the inner teenager because I think
Mm.
a lot of damage done then. But then we also have the inner clown, and we have the
Mm-hmm.
inner the critic, and we have the
Mm-hmm.
inner, that we've got all of these different parts of ourselves, and the relationships between them,
Absolutely.
are, they support each other, or they, put each other down, or they, there's this whole kind of
Oh,
inner.
they're a gang up together. They'll be in cahoots. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. There's this whole
Yeah.
kind of inner world, I mean, I,
Yes.
I
Yeah.
guess I guess that film Inside Out has got some way to that part, because it's got all these little characters that have,
Mm-hmm.
fear and joy
Yeah.
and what have you. Um, but they're sort of the emotions rather than and I think that yes, this makes perfect sense, and it's very much a heart-centered work, because
Mm.
you have to begin, I'm guessing, with so much compassion for yourself in order to actually just start on this road, to just make that step.
Right. And to bring it back to the energy work, which is your work, there are techniques. I heard you mention them before, so you're familiar with them, like tapping, like emotional freedom technique. Well, when you can identify a certain part of you, it's really great to actually tap for that part,
Mm.
even
Yeah.
though a part of me is really scared right now, and I know why, and I know where that story comes from. I completely and deeply love and accept myself. And so there are ways that we can move that energy through that's associated with a part that might be really activated. And I really love this sort of, it's like combining internal family systems with emotional freedom technique, because
Mm.
when we can address those parts, we are actually healing ourselves, and we're moving energy through or getting it to flow in some sort of way. So I think it's an exciting time of really doing this sort of like mashup, if you will, of these
Yeah.
really cool mind body skills.
Exactly. And one of the things you just said there, when you said like a dialogue part that you could
Mm-hmm.
say to yourself. And again, that's something that I feel is so powerful, is essentially they're just affirmations. Some you could call them mantras, or whatever you wanted to
Mm-hmm.
call them, doesn't really matter. You can call it talking to yourself like a mad lady. It doesn't matter what you call it, but actually talking to yourself, like yesterday, for example. So they put the scaffolding up the side of the house, in our renovation, at our renovation, and my husband was up at the top, and he goes, "Oh, come on, I can see the sea from here. You got to come up." And so I'm like, okay, I'm going to be brave. And every rung I was like, I can do this. I'm brave. I can do this. I am brave. And if I hadn't done that, I would have freaked myself out. Talking to yourself, your body, your energetic body hears this
Mm-hmm.
so strongly. If you think about how I would, if I'd gone up that ladder to the top of the house going, oh my God, I'm going to fall. This is terrifying. Then I would have been an absolute nervous wreck when I got to the top.
Yes.
And I'm not
Uh-huh.
saying that I wasn't a little bit shaky when I got to the top, but I made it. And I was very proud of myself. And I was telling myself, I'm really proud of myself. I can do this. I'm strong.
Yes.
You can do this.
Yes.
And these words that we use are really powerful. And it's distinct from thinking. It's a very
Correct.
purposeful.
Yes. Yes. I totally agree with you. I mean, people say, oh, affirmations, they don't work. I'm like, well, you're not you're seeing affirmations in the wrong way. But when you can land on something that actually connects to you and feels real and true and authentic, and you're taking care of that part that's afraid of heights, yeah, of course, no wonder, right? So you're using your own energy, your own self energy, to help calm that part, and it's meaningful in that moment. So I we do have to kind of identify the inner narrative, and then find the the way in that doesn't feel like some sort of, meme that you find online that is meaningless, right? It really
Mm.
has to come from the inside. And I think that, what you're doing is, self-coaching in a way that feels very true to the whole body sensation, right? Because you're feeling all of those sensations of going up the ladder.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I think this is I feel like this is we've kind of like danced around the whole perfectionism, but we have talked about so many good things. But I want to come back to the thing that you said right at the very beginning, which is that the where perfectionism comes from is this sense of wanting to belong and the fear of rejection. And that comes from just experiences that we've had in our lives, right? Right.
Much of it comes from earlier conditioning and life's hardships and disappointments,
Mm,
where a perfectionistic approach helps solve a problem in the moment, not getting in trouble or having to achieve so that you could, I don't know, get through school so that you could get a job and help your family. I mean, there's
mm,
so many reasons why this sort of perfectionism lands on a child's mind. Oh, I just have to look beautiful. I have to lose weight. I have to have the right clothes in order to fit in. I mean, it really all comes down to love and belonging, in my estimation. And I think that that's very sort of heartwarming in a way because otherwise we blame ourselves for never being good enough.
yeah. Yeah, but I also see that there's room here to blame others, to blame the people who did their best trying to bring us up, and that is
Yes.
painful too.
Well, listen, I always say the past is the past and you're not going to change it. The only thing that you can do is change your relationship to the experience of your past. So you have the authority and the accountability to take care of those elements or aspects or blocked energies that were stifled in some way or maybe harmed in some way now. And, in our circles, sometimes we call this spiritual reparenting, is that you can now be the adult to yourself that you didn't have when you needed it, right? And like I don't blame my parents. They were in an impossible situation,
Mm,
back then, and had limited skills and couldn't care for all of us in the way that we needed, and given our sensitivities that, I mean, I think I was born into the world with huge sensitivities. So I was
mm,
not an easy child, I am sure. But we can repair that for ourselves and within the relationships that we choose later in life.
mm.
And then, we can become more forgiving, I think, towards some of those situations in the past, depending on situations, obviously. But it's kind of releasing the attachment to the blaming feelings
Yeah.
that we can hold on
Think
to.
there's a lot of forgiveness that can be
Hmm.
directed inward as well.
Yes.
I think forgiving the self is one of the most powerful things that you
Hmm.
can do because, oh, we blame ourselves. We take it upon ourselves to blame
Exactly.
ourselves for so much that's gone on or going on in our lives. And if we can just release that, then there's a freedom that comes there that
Hmm.
I think is really beautiful. So if somebody's listening to this and they're going, yeah, I didn't think I was a perfectionist, but actually maybe in some aspects I am. Like like I am now sitting here thinking, yeah, I'm definitely recovering people pleaser.
Hmm.
Absolutely recognize a lot of the things that you've said, and so like, oh, okay, so perfectionism has taken on a slightly different definition for me now, having spoken to you, which is great because we love to expand and learn. But what is the one thing that you would, if someone's listening to this and they go, yeah, I'm a perfectionist and it's making my life miserable, or they can be, yeah, I'm a perfectionist and it's great. I love it because everything is exactly how I want it to be.
Hmm.
Is that, is there two sides of this?
Yeah,
Can,
so it's a great question, and it comes up all the time actually in my workshops. Like, when do I know perfectionism is helping me or harming me in some way?
mm,
And I think actually what the research does show is that there's sort of this tipping point or a point of diminishing returns. Is that the striving for excellence or the striving to have things the way you want can be motivating and helpful until it's not,
mm,
until it's exhausted you. But I say the easiest hack is to ask yourself how you're feeling. Now, if you're feeling burned out, irritated, unhappy, then whatever it is that you're doing is not helping you. Perfectionism is harming you. If you're
mm,
saying, okay, I'm striving for excellence and I'm feeling inspired and excited, and even though I don't know what the hell I'm doing, I know where I'm going and that feels good. Okay, then. I would say that you're striving for excellence in a healthy way at that point.
Mhm. Wonderful. Well, listen, this has been so great, Tara. I've
Yeah.
absolutely loved talking to you. I feel like, yeah, there's a lot of other things I would love to talk to you about. I would love for you to be my psychiatrist.
No.
Just so it would be fascinating because to find a psychologist who understands the energy work as well, I think is absolutely golden. I think that's a really beautiful, unique, I don't, hopefully it's not unique, but I think it's a very special combination and a very important one. So thank you. Tell people how they can get in touch with you and how they can get hold of your book, The Perfectionist's Dilemma.
Well, people can find me at my website, taracousineau.com. Of course, my book, and the book has a website called perfectionistdilemma.com, and there are happy achiever tools there. I have some energy medicine tools, free downloads, so people can explore that. And I just started a, a Substack publication called The Peaceful Perfectionist. We'll see where that goes, but that's where I hope to augment some, meditations. I know that you're on Insight Timer too. I have a course on Insight Timer on overcoming perfectionism. So there's lots of ways to actually find me. Just
Perfect.
search for my name. Yeah.
Well, I will put as many of those links in the show notes
Yeah.
as I can.
But I want to thank you too, because I did listen to some of your meditations. They're absolutely beautiful. And I am putting your meditations on my recommendation list for my clients. They're
Thank
beautiful.
you.
They're beautiful. Yeah, I
Oh,
was,
that means a lot.
yeah, no, they're beautiful. I feel like we all need to help each other, and there's so many wonderful teachers in the world, and it really is about sort of sharing that sort of abundance with each
Yeah,
other.
yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for that. And thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, it's been my pleasure.